that. Here, I'm recording now. Okay, so we have to maybe you know, I'll try to do some little comparisons because I know some of you were interested in Locke as well, and we've unfortunately not really gotten to Locke. I thought, would any of you be interested in a video on Locke? I could do that, but it wouldn't be for the exam. Anyways, I'll think about it. Maybe I'll post something to satisfy your curiosity, some of you. So Hobbes, so far we've seen quite a few things, right? Hopefully you're starting to get a sense of Hobbes, and at least able to read him maybe a little better now. You have to read him very, very carefully, very slowly, and you have to be willing in two ways to be linguistically flexible. For one, you're going to have a dictionary out and open, because he's going to use all kinds of words that don't have the meanings any longer that they used to have. So there'll be all kinds of archaic uses of English terms. And second, you just have this issue that whenever Hobbes uses a technical term, he's defining it through the Hobbesian worldview, right? He's redefining it always. And with the first concept we saw that with, and we've probably seen it with a couple, but the one that strikes me most obviously is in this paragraph on equality, right? If you want to know what else Hobbes has to say about equality, the answer is nothing. This is what Hobbes has to say about equality as a political thinker. So as important as the concept of equality seems to be in politics, the idea of equality as something that ought to be the case, that we ought to be treated in certain ways equally, that's not found in Hobbes. In fact, there's nothing in Hobbes that is like, here's how the world is, but here's how it ought to be. Now, for Hobbes, the way the world kind of really is the same as the way it ought to be. He's a materialist, right? You can't really say my computer ought to act differently than it does. One could just say that maybe it would be better if it worked more efficiently or something like that, right? If it worked better according to its own principles. But that it ought to have different principles, that Hobbes is very clear, you know, and this is why he's willing to say, for instance, in a state of nature, when we have all these essentially robots in the world called human beings, all designed to preserve themselves at the cost of others, that when they kill each other, that is the natural consequence. And that is fine. That is the way it should be. So the way he uses should and whatnot and equality, these are all going to be reduced back to some kind of, you know, mechanistic interpretation. So what did Hobbes consider under equality?
The equality of mind and body, which the equality of the mind was greater than that of the physical strength.
Are we perfectly equal?
No.
No.
And I remember we said that some men think they're wiser than their folks, but it's not like that in reality. There are some dissimilarities, but they're almost negligible.
Yeah. So on the whole, his equality is a rough equality, right? And it's a kind of an equality in terms of powers and capacities. Human beings are roughly equal in physical power because none can dominate the other. So this equality is really just in view of the question of competition, right? That's how this is defined, in that nobody can outright win. You know, that's true of, like, yesterday I watched a chess tournament of the top. I play chess. The top world, the world champion and the top 4 or 5 people in the world. And Hobbes would say, well, they're all more or less equal because none of them can on demand beat all the others with absolutely, 100% score, right? He will lose now and then. And in the game of life, that losing means death for Hobbes, right? So if you can lose every now and then, it's good as, winning is not all that important because you're only going to win a few times and then it's over for you. So that equality is more or less an equality of power and strength. And then the second is the equality of the mind, which he says is even more equal because all the mind really is a kind of calculating machine, and all intelligence is the memory of that machine, the more information that it has. So we're more or less equal. And this gives rise to, just one other side note. If we were to read more Hobbes, you would find a lot of offensive things, probably, particularly if you're women, some of you, because like a lot of people in the 18th century, including Hobbes, thought it was natural for men to be politically dominant. And Hobbes here, this would be based upon, well, he for several reasons, right? First of all, they base it in religion, right? That had always been the case. But now in this modern philosophers, they have to give a scientific foundation for it, right? They can't any longer say, well, God said that Adam was ruler over his wife. They can't do that because they have, as you would see if you read Locke, is they've undermined that whole religious, divine right of king's foundation. So they can't appeal to religion anymore. Yet they still are 18th century men. So they still hold these views. They just now want to give, it seems even worse maybe, a scientific foundation for such authority. But here you can see where Hobbes might, and you might say this sounds silly, but Hobbes could say, well, men are all more powerful than women, so men should rule physically and maybe mentally, he would say. Right? I don't know what he'd say mentally. I'm sure he said it somewhere, yes or no, but I'm sure he says physically. And he does later have lots of passages about man's dominion over his family, over his wife and children. So that is absolutely part of his worldview. And you could see maybe right here where it might come in with some idea that men are intrinsically stronger than. Sometimes they also make this other argument. If they don't want to appeal, like Locke doesn't want to appeal to strength, because he actually defends a notion of equality and justice and right that is normative, right? He thinks we are perfectly equal and so on. So he doesn't appeal to power like Hobbes does. And so he makes an argument like this: in a household, someone must rule. You can't have two rulers in a household. And so the rule should go to the one who is more capable, which is the man. Therefore, the man should rule the household, right? That's the kind of argument he would make. So instead of appealing to power, he'd appeal to some kind of obviously false idea that the only means to ruling a household is by one person having the rule. Because it's never, for some reason, to people of this period, the idea that more than one person could simultaneously rule was nonsensical. A ruler is one person. That's it. Because if you had two people, how would you decide which one if they disagreed? So you got to have one ruler. He didn't think you might have a conversation or something like that. Anyways, so that point. So the whole purpose of this equality being introduced is, it sounds, this is very Hobbesian, but it sounds peculiar to us, that equality is the source of all our problems, right? If we weren't equal, if one person could dominate everyone else, we wouldn't really have any problems. We'd have one problem, right? If we were the ruler, we'd have no problems. And if we were everyone else, we'd have only one problem. But instead, everything's a problem for us. It's chaos. It's, as we'll see, a state of war because of equality. Because there's nothing to put us in order, because we're all essentially of equal capacity. So as soon as we get notice that we have equal capacity, so this is a fact, equality. And when we start to think about equality, this is what he talks about in the next section. We start to hope. We say we're no worse than everyone else. We should be able to get by in this world, right? We should be able to accumulate a few things, maybe have a family. We decide that we have the possibility or hope of acquiring life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to some extent, right? But as soon as we do that, we also recognize that as soon as we acquire it, others will try to take it from us. So by what Hobbes thinks is a necessary progression of just reflection, we will go from recognizing our equality to fearing other people. And then he says, and when we fear other people, we fear they're going to take our things. And then we soon realize that there is no more expedient way of protecting ourselves than to get the others under our control before they have a chance to attack us. And so each man naturally, as a result of reality and intelligence, will come to try to dominate their peers as far as possible, with the hope of securing some bit of peace and prosperity for themselves. Okay. That gets us to, that was about here, right? And from hence it comes to pass that where an invader hath no more to fear than another man's single power, if one plant, sow, build, possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to be prepared with forces united to dispossess and deprive him, not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of his life and liberty. And the invader again is in the like danger of another. And this is a shared, right? Each individual has this same sense. You'll notice, and I don't, this is something just to bear in mind. You notice he says, not only of the fruit of your labor, but also of his life or liberty, right? This is something you see throughout a lot of authors in this period. Just if we were to read Locke, you'd find this in Locke as well. They more or less equate theft with murder, right? Taking your things. So he says, depriving you of the fruit of your labor, that's just robbing you, right? But also of his life or liberty. We should just more or less, the idea seems to be that if someone can steal from you, then they can do whatever they like. They must have you in their power. And then they could just as well kill you. So as far as it's legally concerned, anything that means someone putting you under their power so that you cannot resist them, they might as well be killing you. They could just want to steal your banana, right? But since they got a gun on you, right, to steal it, they might as well take your life as well. Of course, criminals sometimes do this. They convince people that they only want to rob them, and then they shoot them, right? So that there's no witness. And that if they convince you that, well, they're not going to kill you, you usually cooperate with them, right? So you'll cooperate for a long time, which is what they want, and then they kill you. They have no reason to be honest with you. Maybe this is what Hobbes and Locke had in mind. But I have the feeling that, well, first of all, it's a very useful principle if you want a quite harsh legal theory, right? Because you can say, well, if someone is robbing me, then they might as well be killing me, so I have the right to kill them, even if they're doing something much more minor, right? And that's often the way it is used in both Hobbes and Locke. I mean, Locke will explicitly say, if someone tries to steal my coat, I have the right to murder them. We don't say that anymore because there'd be too many dead people. if that were to happen. But he says this explicitly. With that being in mind, if you deprive me of my ability to protect myself, then you might as well you could just as well kill me. Okay, so from all of this arises this natural progression of thought, a diffidence for another. There's no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable as anticipation. So said from that springs this idea that the best way to protect oneself is by anticipation, by getting them under control, your control before they get you under their control. And by consequence, such an augmentation, a growing of dominion or power over men being necessary to a man's conservation, it ought to be allowed him, right? This is where Hobbes uses this language of ought, right? But you should sit for a minute when you're reading this text, whenever he uses that word, and say, what does he really mean? They ought. Is he saying that in a state of nature, I ought to allow other people to put me under their dominion? Obviously not, right? Because each individual has this ought right. So it's not like it tells you to do anything. Although ought that's how it's usually used, right? You ought not to lie means you should not lie, right? That I ought to allow him or a person in the state of nature to expand his dominion over others, that's not true. Although he says I ought to allow it to him. Just means I can't say that he has no right to it. My words don't take away his right to do it. My power might. If I'm stronger than him, then he ought not to be allowed it, because I ought to be allowed the opposite, right? So the way the language is being used here can be rather deceptive if you take it in a contemporary normal sense. Again, the next paragraph here is simply saying that when we come together into groups, society, so this paragraph's a little bit low key, but it's saying something quite extreme, which is the only reason we band into any kind of society with other human beings is in order to grow our dominion, right? Either by becoming friendly with them so that their power is our power and we share power to protect ourselves, or some other reason. In any case, the only reason we ever bind together with other people is because of power. It's because of the strength of those individuals. So it says, men have no pleasure in keeping company where there is no power to overawe them all. Of course, that will mean as well in a government. There is no pleasure in being around other people. Hobbes is not a very friendly guy. Right? There's no pleasure in being with other people unless there's a power to control everyone, right, involved. For every man looketh to that his companion should value him at the same rate he sets upon himself, and upon all signs of contempt or undervaluing natural endeavors, as far as he dares, to extort a greater value from his contemners by damage and from others by example. Right. So we when we're in a group with others, we kind of demand that they respect us. This is a kind of power, right? He says, and if they don't, we pay them back we try to get them to respect us by damage. So having a good reputation or impressing people is one way of influencing them. He's saying, and if that doesn't work, then you try to harm them, right? And from others by example, he says. So that in the nature of man, we find three principal causes of quarrel. So three main causes of war in human being, right? The first is competition. Second is this diffidence, the fear of others. and the third is glory. So we'll see diffidence is the main one for Hobbes. The first, which is competition, makes men invade for gain. The second for safety, and the third for reputation. The first use violence to make themselves masters of other men's persons, wives, children, and cattle. The second to defend them, and the third for trifles, in a word, for a smile, a different opinion, or any other sign of value, either direct in their persons or by reflection in their kindred, by their friends, their nation, their profession, or their name. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. So this is the famous, there are a couple famous Hobbesian claims. One is that the state of nature is a state of war, right? There are no laws in the state of nature. It is just chaos and war. The other famous one is a quote we'll maybe see later where he says, in such a condition, life is, terrible. It's brutish and short, right? That's the way life is in the state of nature, without a power. Again, what's the idea being? He's already more or less founded his argument, right? Saying, with this condition of nature, the only way it can be improved is by the creation of a power to keep us all in awe, right? That's what government is. That's the function government serves. If you want to ask a question like, what is the purpose of government for Hobbes? It is to keep us in awe, to threaten us into not attacking one another, right? To keep the peace or to establish peace as far as possible. That is the purpose of government. So you can see kind of what Hobbes is doing as if you opposed it to, say, a traditional theory like that the power of kings is based upon a divine sanction or something like that. Instead, he's studying, he claims to be at least, studying the nature of the human being, right? Understanding what the human being is like without government, and then trying to trace from that state why a government should be there, if it should be there at all, right? And then to exactly determine the rules of such a government from the nature of the problem that government is introduced to solve. And then nothing else is in government, right? Like all the other things that, say, traditional religion had taken for how government should be run and so on and so forth, that's all gone, right? All of that was thrown out at the beginning when he tried to reconstruct from the very nature of the human being what a political theory, right? So in a way, there's a parallel there with Descartes, right? Descartes throwing away all previous science to reconstruct science on a new foundation. Same kind of thing going on. Now, in the next part, in the end of this paragraph, he goes into this problem a little bit about, it's not very important, but what is meant exactly by this state of war. So someone might object, Hobbes, but yeah, what if it rains and everybody goes home? Are we still in a state of war? People get tired. People, there aren't a lot of people in the world in this original state, maybe. Maybe they don't even run into each other out in the forest. What are you talking about? First of all, Hobbes' state of nature, interestingly, is not really, he's not really thinking anthropologically about the history of man. What must men have been like, in primitive times? That's not what he's thinking about. For him, the state of nature, this original state of nature before government, he's thinking of it in terms of what people are like in England in his own time when there's no government there. He's thinking about civil war, right? Which is very different from thinking about how human beings might have been before there were governments. This is one issue that Hobbes doesn't talk about. And this is one of the main bases of objections to Hobbes' political theory, which is that the state of nature you're talking about is not really a state of nature. It's a state of culture without a political system. The culture was generated in the presence of a political system. And if you just remove the political system from the culture that's already there, then of course you're going to have problems. Then of course people in society have been trained to compete with each other, for instance. But maybe human beings are not naturally competitive. You see that point? In capitalism, for instance, you're just taught you're supposed to try to win at all costs. And maybe all these rules, all this, what Hobbes is referring to as the nature of man is the nature of modern man in modern societies. And that's not truly the nature of man. So if you want to really start at the beginning, Mr. Hobbes, the very beginning, and reconstruct a proper political theory, you should think a little bit about what the nature of man might really be. Maybe it's not dominated by these three principles. Maybe these are the three principles of selfish modern man living in a modern competitive society like you live in. And of course, as soon as there's no law, you've all been trying to beat each other with society. As soon as society is done, you're going to just attack each other. Of course, that's the way civil war is going to be. But human beings didn't have those. And so someone like Rousseau is the first person to really think a lot about this and to say, for instance, a lot of the desires that human beings have do not exist before society. They're generated through society or are generated through education. And this is why someone like Rousseau is kind of skeptical or negative about the value of certain aspects of modern culture, because they generate in the human being unnatural desires, right? If you lived in the United States, some of you have been in the United States probably, you enter the United States and you just start spending money. It's insane, right? And many people in the United States are, because you can be, right? With Amazon particularly, it's a different world because you can just like click and buy stuff, and your brain gets a shot of dopamine every time you do so. So it's like drugs. So people just buy. You've probably seen these TV shows of people who don't have a lot of money but have houses full of garbage in the United States. There's a lot of these people. Why? Because they just need to buy things to feel better about themselves. That's a learned behavior. That's not possible without a certain kind of social structure around you, right? If you took someone, a person from a tribe, or even, probably a lot of people from Lebanon, and put them there, it would take them a while to develop that desire. At first, they wouldn't even know why you'd probably want to do it, right? Like, okay, it's nice to, okay, we all buy things, so we all already have our gateway drug, as it were, to such a thing. But particularly someone who maybe there are still these people who live in tribes, and they never buy anything. They don't probably even wonder what this buying stuff is about. They just grow their own food and whatever. They clearly wouldn't get the same kind of pleasure that you and I get out of buying something useless, right? But we do, and this is so we and it's understandable that someone like Hobbes or others who haven't thought a lot about this might think, well, the human being just is innately, designed to buy things. But that's kind of weird, because buying is not a natural thing, right? We're not like that. That's a developed, as impossible as it may be for some of us to break such a habit. It's not a natural one, right? So, in other words, when Hobbes starts, Hobbes is important again, because he starts this whole way of thinking about political theory, going back to nature and reconstructing political theory. But the fact that he tried to do it, of course, is great. But how he specifically did it has been criticized ever since he put pen to paper, right? But still, that's in the spirit of people saying, well, you found the right path. We just have to do it better than you did it, right? And that kind of is found throughout all kind of modern political theory. The same style, the same talk about a state of nature and how reason develops out of that state of nature and so on. And using that to determine what the rules and laws of a state might be. Okay, so what is he saying in the rest of this paragraph? That's where I started here. We're not always in a state of war, in a state of nature. As I said, some people, you might go to sleep or whatever. So what do you mean it's always a state of war? Maybe it's just a state of war when we're fighting. And Hobbes says, that's not what I mean by war. War is not actual fighting for me. War is the tendency to fight. Like, to have bad weather doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be raining, right? It can just be cloudy and be prepared to rain at any time. And he's basically, Hobbes says, without a government, there's always the potential for war because there's nothing to stop it. And there is something within each human being to generate it, right? So if there's nothing to stop it and there's always a tendency towards it, then society is unstable, or there is no society. Might as well call this a state of war. So state of war for him is just a constant tendency towards open battle. It doesn't mean open battle itself, right? So even if we weren't fighting in a state of nature, we would still need a government to prevent the possibility of fighting. That's what he's saying. He uses the example of weather here. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together. So the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during all the time there is no assurance of the contrary. All other time is peace. Now this is where we come to this very famous quotation of Hobbes. Someone want to read in such a condition?
I can read it.
Okay.
I can. Go, Joy.
In such condition, there is no industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and danger of violent death and the life of men, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Pleasant. That is probably the most famous, this last line is probably the most famous line in political theory, perhaps, and certainly of Hobbes. He has a sounds like a pretty negative assessment. Yeah. Essentially, there's no stability. So there's no real hope of anything. This is where you can see where this is the earliest root of, that line from the American Constitution, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? This is the role of government. It's to make a framework within which those things can happen. It's not to give you life. It's not to give you liberty. It's not to give you happiness. It's to create the framework within which such a thing can even be sought, right? So for Hobbes, without a government, life is hopeless. Nothing can be achieved because as soon as you achieve it, you will be dead, right? And as soon as you achieve it, someone else will steal it from you if they don't kill you, right? So there's nothing stable. There's no stability. And so it's not a good situation. Of course, again, he's thinking not about, Rousseau will say later, wait a minute, isn't the state of nature one in which, we're all kind of happily living with the animals in the forest? And There are no farms because we can just pick the fruit off the tree and eat it, and we don't have a lot of people, so we don't need industry, and we don't need anything in a state of nature. Isn't that the case? I mean, look at people who live in nature. They live on so little. They don't need much. Why would I need in a state of nature a commodious building? In the state of nature, all I would need is a hut for my family and myself. What I only need an enormous building, a commodious, which is what it means, right? A very large building. If I want to look up and glorify myself, right? And to show my power to other human beings. But if I don't care about other human beings, if I am in a state of nature before society, if I don't worry, I wouldn't desire glory, like put me on an island, which is what a state of nature would be like, Hobbes or Rousseau says, because a state of nature in the beginning, there's very few people, right? There wouldn't be huge cities and so on. There would be no point in impressing other people, so glory wouldn't be a power, right? You don't glorify yourself when you're alone. You only glorify yourself when you're in society with other people already, because that's a means to power in society. So you could see where someone might start to think about this and say, no, what Hobbes is really doing here, life for man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in a world where you have all these extravagant desires for commodious buildings, for navigating all over the world, for having letters in society and so forth, right? What is that world? That is contemporary England in a state of civil war. That's what he's describing, right? Any questions so far? No, pretty clear. His text isn't all that clear, I'll tell you that. Now he's going to go into a couple of objections, right? Is this really, I brought up many objections from other writers, but he knows that as soon as people read this, they're going to wonder, is this truly the case, what Hobbes is saying? Is this the nature of man? And so he's not going to say, well, he doesn't know about Rousseau. He wouldn't even accept Rousseau's theory anyways, probably. But why? Because Rousseau's theory is based upon a kind of historical reconstruction of the past. He would say everything that I just said and say, or hear everything I just said and say, but remember what the method here is. The method is introspection. The method is look at yourself. You think man in a state of nature is kind and doesn't have desires. Well, what do you base that on? The only thing you can base it on is knowledge of your own self. Of course, I'm not a man in a state of nature. This kind of shows you why he would be he would think of natural man as man in England during Civil War, because he was looking within himself, who was a man in England during Civil War, right? But because that's his method. So here he says, he just tries to give some examples to say, so it may seem strange to some that has not well weighed these things, that nature should thus disassociate and render men apt to invade and destroy one another, etc. Let him therefore consider with himself. Turn to himself. When taking a journey, he arms himself and seeks to go well accompanied. When going to sleep, he locks his doors. When even in his house, he locks his chests. And this when he knows there be laws and public officers armed to revenge all injuries that shall be done to him. What opinion he has of his fellow subjects when he rides armed, of his fellow citizens when he locks his doors, of his children and servants when he locks his chests, right? So Hobbes locks his money away in his own house for fear of his own children stealing it, is what he's telling us, right? And his servants. Does he not there as much accuse mankind by his actions as I do by my words? but neither of us accuse man's nature in it. Why? So this last sentence, we'll talk about this in a second. But so he's just saying, look at your actions. I mean, Akasha, when you fly, you take a gun with you, right? You arm yourself to the teeth. Now, people did, of course, then, right? It was a different time. They carried weapons with them because there was a very good chance you would be robbed on a trip in between cities. It was a good place for robbers to make their living. It was that way since ancient times. We've kind of moved past that, so you can kind of see how Hobbes' supposed analysis of human nature isn't quite as convincing anymore, is it? It should have.
I mean, yeah, but
Go ahead.
he's based his entire theory on an analysis of the man at the time.
Yeah.
If he were to take a primitive man and then start from original basis, then maybe it would have still been applicable. But as you said, I mean, he's locking his chests inside of his own house. So that's, I mean, that shows a totally different level of security than, maybe not in Lebanon, but still.
Yeah, true. When I first moved to Lebanon, so this is good. This is a good point, right? Why Lebanon? I mean, you'll find it also elsewhere. I mean, there are people in the United States that got their stuff all locked up like crazy, as if everybody's after it. But in Lebanon, when I moved into my apartment in Hamra here, it had this enormous metal door, and which I thought was interesting, right? I mean, it has a normal door, and then outside the door, it had a secondary door, which was clearly like like supposed to resist, armed men. And the landlord, who was very old, said, keep this door shut. Because if there's a problem, people will come and take your children. This is what my landlord said here. Now, we kind of chuckled, but obviously he put that door in there during the Civil War, right? And still has this, some of you probably know people that are like this. They still are like, yes, you think everybody's nice, but just wait, you see. You should keep everything locked up. So yeah. The other thing Hobbes could say in response to us, though, is, and the funny thing is that although this doesn't look as convincing on the face of it, this is the same kind of thinking that make a lot of students like Hobbes. They say, oh yeah, we know people are really like that. This is very realistic. Why don't I lock my door? Well, only because there is a government in place that will punish them. They don't rob me because they're afraid of the consequences, not because they don't want to rob me. None of you are going to cheat, not because you don't want to cheat, but because you're afraid of being caught. Because there is a power that keeps you in awe, right? And so, yeah, when there's a government, now Hobbes is the only difference then is that Hobbes's government couldn't control things as well as ours do today, even in Lebanon. Like, it was just, there weren't a lot of police. I mean, how many police were there? There was, you probably had a hard time finding a policeman. Although in Lebanon, I must say, I never see police, except for these guys with, guns around the buildings. But other than that, I don't see them. Anyways, but he says in this, so he's saying, look, you accuse them by your actions, by the way you act. You are essentially stating that you really do believe what I said, even if you say you don't. Until you stop acting this way, I will just take your actions as equivalent to words. But he goes on to say, but you misunderstand me in a way. You don't want to say this about human beings because you think it's really saying something bad about them. But I am not saying anything bad about them. I am just describing what they are, right? You say the lion would tear apart a baby that it found in the forest. that's nothing negative about the lion. That's just what it is, right? I'm not accusing it of anything. In fact, I would say that's what a lion should do. So that's why we shouldn't put our babies out in the forest, right? If you do, what do you expect? So he says, neither of us accuse man's nature in it. The desires and other passions of man are in themselves no sin. Okay, this is quite radical, isn't it? Not only with respect to political theory, but just religion and anything. Like, man's desires are no sin. No more are the actions that proceed from those passions, till they know a law that forbids them. Nothing is wrong until there is a law that forbids it. In the absence of society, everything goes. Which till laws be made, they cannot know. Right? So there's nothing that can be called wrong until you are taught a law that says not to do it. That means in man's nature, in man's mind, before society or anything else, there is no sense of right and wrong, except for what I want and what I don't want. So there's a whole group of philosophers and people who think that there is a sense of right and wrong, and then it doesn't depend upon government or society, right? That like any human being seeing a child being tortured would have empathy, right? And would feel that was wrong, no matter how they'd been educated, or, I mean, they could maybe be brainwashed or something to no longer, or be given a rationale, but just in their natural state, they would see that as wrong, right? And then there are others like Hobbes who say, no, it's just not the case. And even if they did, it wouldn't be wrong for that purpose, for that reason. So there is no principle of right and wrong prior to law. Which till laws be made, they cannot know, nor can any law be made till they have agreed upon the person that shall make it. So there's a further condition. Not only is there no right and wrong before there's a law, but there's no right and wrong before we have agreed, contract, consent on a person who has the right to make the law. Now you say, well, how is Hobbes going to think about religion here, right? Like, first of all, he's going to say, he's going to have to say some weird things, right? So from a Christian point of view, for instance, before, the ancient Greeks, they couldn't do right or wrong. It's not possible. So he will accept that maybe God revealed laws because he has this stuff in his so God maybe revealed laws through religion, right? God may punish human beings as a result of breaking God's laws, and so on. And there are sins. There may even be sins even when there's no government on earth, if there is a government established by God through revelation. But the model the way he's going to understand religion is like a parallel government with natural political society. Now, what's interesting about religious government is that case where, I said, if it turned out Dr. Fugate was so overawingly powerful that I could destroy all of you at my command, then Hobbes would say Dr. Fugate should rule, and that's it, and the law is what he commands. That's like God, right? That's how Hobbes will think about God, as that kind of possibility that there is one person who is more powerful than everyone else, and then we are just under the power of God, right? But Hobbes always talks like this, but God isn't going to punish me till later. I don't see him. So for now, we need another government, right, to do this in the world. And it's each person's own issue about how they relate in religion, through their religions, to this all-powerful, king, essentially, right? And whether they want to follow his laws or not. But that's not my business. And so he leaves that out, right? Did someone want to say something about that?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if he has any thoughts about the idea of a contract in religion. Is that still applicable? Like, if I haven't agreed to a contract or I'm not religious, then technically God cannot punish me because I never agreed that I will abide by those particular.
We only need the contract in the state of equality, when there's equality, right? It's only when I need the other person to give up the power, to give up their power over me, and I give my power over them to a third power. But in the case of religion, it would be, as I said, different, because there's no equality between man and God. So there can be no contract between man and God in that sense. God doesn't give up anything. Nor does God get his power from our voluntarily giving up our power. Right. So although the basic idea is the same, basically the rule is power, the circumstances are different. Now, that's just to say, when he says, these things are in themselves no sin, you say, well, wait a minute, what about religion? Sin sounds like religion. Is he saying there's no religion until there are like state laws and stuff? That would be weird, right? No, he's not saying that. In fact, what he says here is perfectly consistent with the idea that there is a law propounded by God through revelation, and that God is all powerful, and you just have to submit to that. And though things are sins in that way, but that's not relevant to political theory, because we don't all see that God punishing people and so on, and we can't rely on that. So we have to create a visible God to overawe us, which is the king, in other words. And that, however, since we're all equal, can only come about through the establishment through a contract and so on and so forth, right? Because of so he says, it may peradventure be thought there was never such a time nor condition of war as this, and I believe it was never generally so all over the world. So he accepts that there was never a pure state of war all over the world. But there are many places where they live now. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Lust just means pleasure. It doesn't sound, it's not what it sounds like. Families aren't all built on lust in a modern sense. They're just because what's desired. So this reference to North America, I think that is quite indicative. Locke will also often refer to North America as the image of a natural man, right? Of a natural state. Now the difference is, a little bit of the difference is that Hobbes will thinks about it. It's interesting how he thinks about it, right? Like there's no, I think that the North American Indians had a quite well structured society, right? There's quite a hierarchy of rulers and people who obey them, and people with power and punishment and all kinds of things. But for Hobbes, he knows absolutely nothing about the Indians in North America. So he just imagines they're just all these wild peoples, right? And that the closest thing they have to organization is individual families. It's just completely ignorant of what was going on. But nevertheless, though he's ignorant of it, he doesn't mind bringing it in as evidence for what he's talking about. Locke will do the same thing, but Locke actually, instead of thinking of it as just some kind of weird world in which everyone is just savage, he thinks of the Indians in North America mainly in terms of foreign peoples that we might encounter as we travel the globe. And so he's worried about how we would interact with them if there were no laws, and whether we should really accept that if I go to North America on a ship and I get off and an Indian kills me, that was his right, which is what Hobbes would have to say. Because there's no laws and no government in North America, so there's no wrong. So I'm kind of in trouble if I get off the ship. I mean, of course I am anyways, but I would have nothing to say, like they shouldn't have done that. Whereas Locke wants us to be able to say that. When they kill you when you get off the ship in North America, you have a gripe, right? This is what Locke will think, because there are laws in a state of nature for Locke, but not for Hobbes. So this is a war of every man against every man. As such, nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. This kind of all follows from what we've said, right? Prior to war, there is no just or unjust. There's no right or wrong. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no justice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues, right? So far from these things being bad, they are strength, right? They are power. Fraud and war, fraud and force. These are good things, desirable things in a state of nature. Again, I said this is, you shouldn't really see this necessarily as Hobbes saying, this is really all great. This is a bad life. Try to avoid it. He's trying to motivate why we must have a government, because otherwise you have to accept this world. Okay, I want to make a little progress here since we have no chance to make it later. Okay. So now he's going to transition at the end of this section, having fully convinced us of the horrible condition that is the state of nature, that it's these same problems, the problems created by equality, that incline us to endeavor peace, right? So in other words, that's the next step. We saw there's kind of a natural progression of reasoning from recognition of equality to hope, to fear, to preemptive war, and then from preemptive war to the horribleness of that, the instability of that, then finally to the desire to find a means to establish peace again, right? And that's the step we're to now. What inclines us to peace? Same things that incline us to war, right? But thought a little bit more about, having thought a little bit more about them. So fear of death, that inclines us to peace. Desire of such things as are necessary to commodious living, and the hope that by their industry to obtain them. Notice, these aren't really much different from the reasons for war, right? They're the same things, just slightly, just transformed in the light of the knowledge that by themselves they lead to, they do not lead to self-preservation, right? They lead to the opposite of it. He doesn't use the word self-preservation, of course. He's been using the word conservation of the self, which is a similar word. And reason, now notice reason. Here we get our first instance of reason. And reason suggesteth convenient articles of peace, upon which men may be drawn to agreement. These articles are which which otherwise are called the laws of nature, whereof I shall speak more particularly in the following chapters. So from this reason, so it's been reason all along, right? Developing us from step to step. But here it starts to propose means, devise means for establishing and maintaining peace. Those means are described in what he calls articles. Those articles, he says, are otherwise known as the laws of nature. This might seem surprising, but the laws of nature are devised by reason. Not the laws of physical nature, not the laws of action and reaction and so on, but the natural laws of the state, right? This is part of what traditionally is called natural law theory. The idea that there are rules that govern how there are states with laws, right? But there are rules, there are higher order rules that govern how those laws are created and enforced and so on. So there's higher order laws than the positive laws of the state. And those laws are common to all societies. And those are, for that reason, called natural laws. Right, so natural law theory is the theory of the laws that apply to any state as such. And those are usually laws about how a state is constituted, right? The conditions for constituting a state. So don't be confused here. Reason devises the laws of the natural laws of the state, the laws of nature. But by that, he means the laws of politics and so on, okay? So it's doing so with a purpose, to avoid a fear of death, and to desire in service of its desire for a nice way of living and the hope of obtaining those things. Okay, so now he's going to give a little bit of some definitions here. So you see this chapter is on the first and second law, natural laws, and of contracts, right? The right of nature. So we already talked about the concept of equality. Now this first section, this first paragraph is on right. Would someone like to read this passage on right, starting with the right of nature?
I can read.
Okay, Hadi, go ahead.
The right of nature, which writers commonly call jus naturel, is the liberty each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. This is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which, in his own judgment and reason, he shall conceive to be the aptest mean Ferento. Aptest means
Thereunto.
Thereunto.
Thereunto, yes.
Okay.
What is a right? What do you and I usually call a right? Can you describe a right? What are your rights, Hadi?
The right as in on my right side, or the right as in my right?
Right, we're talking about politics here, not anatomy.
I still don't understand which one.
In politics, rights.
So the right is the Conservative Party mostly.
Oh no, not in sense of political, not in the sense of left or right, of conservative or progressive or whatever. No, rights in terms of you have certain inalienable rights, it is sometimes said.
Something that I get just by something that I get as a citizen in a country, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or human rights, right? There's this body in Europe that believes it's able to determine whether a country has violated human rights. You have the right not to be tortured. You have the right to free speech. Maybe. Yeah.
In some countries.
Yeah. So these are the kinds of rights I'm talking about. What are those things? How would you describe those?
Something that just the fact that me being a human in a specific country, I have the right to free healthcare or freedom of speech, something that I don't need to work for. By equality, I have it and everyone else around me have it.
something that is guaranteed to you, right?
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
it's something that others should not violate,
Exactly.
protected against others violating it, right? So it's not only, so that I have the right to free speech doesn't mean that someone, if I can't speak for myself, someone must step in and speak for me. No. It means that if I attempt to exercise my speech rights and someone stops me, the government will step in and stop them in turn from that, right? So it's a protection. Sometimes these are kinds of protections. Even when you think of like healthcare, it's kind of a protection against not having healthcare. It's not really a positive provision of healthcare, right? It's not that they have to buy you healthcare or something. It's just that they have to guarantee that you don't lack it, right? But here, so let's see, is that what Hobbes means by a right? This is his definition of right. The right of nature, which writers commonly call, you said, jus naturale, right? That's just Latin for natural right. That's all it means, natural justice, is the liberty of each man, the freedom, liberty, of each man hath to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature. This doesn't sound anything like what we just said, does it? The right of nature is the freedom one has to use his own power to preserve himself. It's not a protection against anything, right? That is to say, his own life, and consequently of doing anything which is in his own judgment or reason, he shall conceive to be aptest thereunto. So I'm wired to preserve myself. My right is anything I would do to do that reasonably. That may mean killing you. In a state of nature, it does mean killing you. So in a state of nature, I have a right to kill you.
But doesn't that mean I have the right to kill you to preserve myself, not just the right to kill you whenever I want, wherever I want?
But I can, but by essentially you are intrinsically a threat to me as another human being. So it comes to the same thing.
Okay.
Because I can reasonably expect in a state of war that you are my adversary. So I have the right to kill you. So right is basically just means whatever you actually are going to do, if you're think about it and what you should do in a state of nature to preserve yourself at all costs, that is right. That's right for Hobbes. Hobbes is going to say those other people who talk about rights as like things you ought to have or protections. That's nonsense. It's based in nothing. All right, this is the only real definition of right. You have the right to what you can do. That's it. If someone stops you from doing it, so here's a weird thing. In a state of nature, I have a right to kill you, and you have a right to stop me from killing you. All right? You have a right to kill me. It's not very great. Not a good situation. You don't have, in other words, from our point of view, right, what this means in Hobbes' state of nature is no one has any rights whatsoever. That's what we would say. Because I have no protections against anything. But Hobbes says, what are you talking about? Protections from whom? In a state of nature, there is no one to protect you. You're talking about, you don't even know what you're saying, Hobbes would say. Doesn't even make sense what you just said. How could you have protections when there's no one to protect you? It's like saying I'm running my software on a computer that doesn't exist, right? It doesn't make any sense. So there can be no protections where there is no one to protect. That's why there can be no laws for Hobbes when there's no king to enforce those laws. You cannot have a law without someone to enforce the law. The two things go together. Okay, so that's what right is. What is liberty? Well, we already seen liberty used here before he defines it. Liberty, according to the proper signification of the word, right? He's tipping you off. I know this is not what you think liberty is, but this is what it really is the absence of external impediments, which impediments may often take away part of a man's power to do what he would, but cannot hinder him from using the power left him according to his judgment and reason as it shall dictate. So freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want in the sense of choosing to do what you want. Freedom is about, once you have chosen things, nothing holding you down and stopping you from doing it, right? So freedom is the ability to move your arms and legs and to do whatever you want with them, basically. Freedom, liberty, true freedom is the freedom to kill other people, to put them under your power, and so on. And lack of freedom is when they put you under their power. That's what freedom is. A law of nature, then, is a precept or a general rule found out by reason by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive to his life, or taketh away the means for preserving the same, and to omit that which he thinketh it may be best preserved, that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. For though they that speak of this subject use to confound jus and lex, right and law, yet they ought to be distinguished, because right consists in the liberty to do or not to do, whereas law determineth and bindeth to one of them. So that law and right differ as much as obligation and liberty, which is one and the same which in one and the same matter are inconsistent. So he says, you and I also think this way. We tend to think that rights are part of law, right? It's in the US Constitution. The Bill of Rights is part of the founding law of the state, right? Protections, rights, and laws go together. Laws establish rights, don't they? Hobbes says no. Rights and law are opposites. Right is the freedom to do whatever you want. Law is constraining you to not do whatever you want, right? Law is something, so he defines it as something found by reason. This is a natural law. It's found by reasoning. And it forbids you to do that which is destructive to your life, and so on and so forth. We'll see. So these laws are all going to command peace in some way. They're all going to be commands of self-preservation. That's what laws are all going to be. Commands, you might say, of rational self-preservation, because they're found out by reason. So you get this difference now? So for him, he says they're inconsistent. Rights is freedom to do whatever you desire, whatever you would do. Right? Laws constrain that. So they're opposites. So what are you talking about? Why would you have rights in your laws? That makes no sense. This is oil and water. So he goes on to kind of clarify these, but we've already said this. So he says, according to this, it followeth that in such a condition, a condition of war, every man has a right to everything, even to another's body. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there can be no security for any man, how strong or wise soever he be, of living out the time of which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. And consequently, it is a precept or general rule of reason. Here we go, our first law of nature. That every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all the helps and advantages of war. The first branch of which containeth the first and fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can to defend ourselves. Hobbes's rules are always going to be like this, because as I said, he's never going to use this language of ought in terms of like, you should do that no matter what. That's how you and I usually think of it, right? Like the law says you should never kill anybody, no matter what. You should never lie, no matter what, right? Hobbes doesn't have any place for a rule like that, right? Because all his rules are about what you should do if you're intelligent to preserve yourself and your own advantage. So the rule has to be something like this. Don't lie if lying is the best way to pursue your advantage. Do lie if that's the best way to preserve your advantage or yourself, right? You do whatever pursues that goal. Now, unfortunately, pursuing that goal in the negative way isn't very efficient, doesn't work. But it is still the best way if no one else cooperates with you. So if other people around you say, well, to hell with the government, I'm reverting to war, and you say, no, I'm not going to kill you because I'm going to follow the rules, and they murder you, well, too bad for you. Right? You say everybody else is lying, but I'm going to stand up for the truth. Hobbes says, well, what are you doing? That's stupid. You only tell the truth because other people have agreed to tell the truth as long as you do. As soon as they violate that, the law is lie now. Right? The law tells you now do what do the smart thing. That's the Hobbesian rule of nature, given the circumstances. And as the circumstances change, what you should do should change, right? So
I think he's
go ahead.
I think he's just a sociopath who knows how to write properly.
Yeah, he's a sociopath. He thinks he has the right to your body. Yeah, if there's no law, this is something wrong with this guy. So notice, this first this precept found out by reason has these two branches, right? Every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. If you don't have the hope of obtaining it, you ought not to endeavor for it. That's the second one. And when he cannot obtain it, he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war, right? The first one is the fundamental law of nature, which is seek peace and follow it. The second, it's the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can do to defend ourselves, right? From this fundamental law of nature by which men are commanded to endeavor peace is derived this second law, that a man, notice derived from the law, that a man will be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down his rights to all things. So for the sake of peace, so basically all the laws are derived like this. The fundamental law is seek peace, and as long as you have the hope of obtaining it, and if you don't have the hope, go to war, right? X is a means to peace. Therefore, new law, do X, as long as you have the hope that it will work. And insofar as you don't have the hope that it will work, don't do it, right? And this is the general pattern of derivation in Hobbes's, of all the laws, no matter what they look like. And so you could say there may be lots of laws, like later there's laws about being friendly to other people. You say, wait a minute, Hobbes is like, he thinks everybody's just horrible. What are you talking about? There's a law saying I should be friendly with other people. It says, but if you're not friendly with other people, that naturally makes people dislike you. Disliking each other leads to conflict, and conflict leads possibly to war. So try to conform yourself to other people. law of nature. He even has one of these. It goes much further than most of us would say, right? Because modern society says, okay, we have to do these things to keep the peace, and then everything else you can do whatever you like, right? If you fulfill these things, then you can wear whatever you like, you can say whatever you like. Even in places like North America, saying things, racist things, is protected by the law. In Hobbes's world, that would, of course he was racist, so he doesn't think that's going to threaten his society. But if saying racist things threatened the peace of society and caused people unrest, then Hobbes would say there's a law against it, right? Because law ultimately is peace. So we should do everything as much as we can to endeavor peace. So he would go even further in the restriction of what we call rights for the sake of peace than we would, because he thinks war is so much more of a danger than we, for some reason, think. Now here he says, so this is the second, and this is the one where government is established right here at this moment. Because we say, in order to endeavor peace, we must be willing to give up our rights to all things. By rights, he means our freedom to do whatever we want, right? We must give up our rights to things in order to endeavor peace. And be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. For as long as every man holdeth his right of doing anything he liketh, so long are all men in a condition of war. So if we want to endeavor peace, we have to give up that right of nature. And establish a government, right? And a government is nothing but a mechanism that ensures each of us that the others will follow what they say. So if someone says they give up their right to my body, then I can't really trust them to do that unless there's a power to keep them in check. And that power is a government, and that's the whole purpose of having a government. But if other men will not lay down their right as well as he, then there is no reason for anyone to divest himself of his. Right? So if the other person doesn't give up their right to kill you, then there is no reason for you to give up your right to kill them. So this is a reciprocal giving up of rights. It can only be reciprocal. For what were exposed to him, that were to expose himself to prey, which no man is bound to do, rather than to dispose himself to peace. This is the law of the gospel. Whatsoever you requireth that others should do to you, that do ye unto them. You think that's what the gospel means? You have the right to kill anyone you like, but you should agree together not to kill each other. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Right? No, it's completely different, supposedly, the meaning of the Gospels. But he's not, Hobbes will say that, no, this is what the gospel really meant. This is what it really meant. And that the law of all men, and then there's some Latin.
Yes. But it's 12:37, and I think you have another class.
Yes, I do.
So
you should. Yeah. Thanks so much. I gotta go, guys.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.